Colonial North Carolina. A land inhabited by Indians for countless generations. Now Europeans were making the same land their home. As settlement and trade increased, the colony grew and prospered, but it was at the expense of the Indians' land and culture. In the east, a number of important towns were established along the principal waterways. Among them was the port of Brunswick town, which accounted for much of the colony's trade in lumber and naval stores, tar, pitch, turpentine, and rosin. Very quickly, the Cape Fear River port became the British Empire's most valuable source of naval stores for maintaining the Royal Navy. Politically, Brunswick town served as the seat of New Hanover County and later Brunswick County. The Colonial Assembly met at the town often, and Royal Governors Arthur Dobbs and William Tryon were residents during most of their administrations. The future of Brunswick seemed promising, but with the outbreak of the American Revolution, all hopes were shattered when the town was burned by an invading British army. During the years that followed, Brunswick was unable to recover. In 1842, the land that the village occupied was sold for $4.25, and the town of Brunswick and much of its history sank into oblivion. But only temporarily. Through historical research and archaeological investigation in the 1950s and 60s, the story of Brunswick was literally uncovered, and a new and exciting chapter was added to the colonial history of the Lower Cape Fear, a history that dates from the first attempted settlement of the region nearly 60 years before the first Roanoke Island colony. The year was 1526. Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón led an expedition of 500 Spaniards from Santo Domingo in the West Indies to the mouth of the Cape Fear River. As the expedition entered the river, one of the ships was wrecked. Thus the colonists set out to build another ship, perhaps the first by Europeans in North America. But illness and mutiny forced the colonists to move southward, where they eventually disbanded and returned to the West Indies. In the 1660s, about 140 years after the Spanish had left the area, there were two more attempts to settle the Cape Fear, but these also met with failure. Another half-century elapsed. In 1715, Colonel Maurice Moore, on a military expedition to aid South Carolina, passed through the Lower Cape Fear. He was so impressed with the area that in 1725 he obtained on the river's west bank a grant of 1,500 acres. On 320 acres overlooking the river, Moore laid out the town of Brunswick in honor of King George I, who was also the Duke of Brunswick. The town had 336 half-acre lots, each 82.5 feet by 264 feet. Later, Maurice Moore's brother, Roger, who built Orton Plantation just north of Brunswick, added 20 more lots to the town. In addition to home sites, there were specific lots designated for the construction of a church, courthouse, jail, stocks, and pillory. But a large number of the lots in Brunswick were never sold, and much of the land remained undeveloped. Only two of the sandy streets of Brunswick had names, Front Street and 2nd Street. Both ran parallel to the river. The connecting streets were sometimes referred to as alleys, cross streets, or upper streets. One of the most interesting structures in Brunswick was a 6-room inn or public house. The rooms were arranged in a row similar to the modern motel. In their excavations, the archaeologists found numerous sewing articles in 5 of the 6 rooms. This indicated that the public house may have been used as a tailor shop at one time. Since it was customary for the citizens of Brunswick to dispose of refuse in their backyards, the archaeologists found an interesting array of materials behind the public house. Broken dishes, bones, glassware, rum bottles, and other items were found to a depth of 3 feet. Perhaps the most impressive residence at Brunswick was Russellborough, the home of 2 royal governors. Begun in the early 1750s by Captain John Russell, this 2-story frame house was unfinished when Governor Arthur Dobbs bought it in 1758. Dobbs completed work on the house and lived there until his death in 1765. William Tryon succeeded Dobbs as governor, and he lived at Russellborough until Tryon Palace was completed in Newbern in 1770. The next year, Tryon sold the house to William Dry, collector of customs for Port Brunswick. 5 years later, Russellborough was in ashes, a victim of the British torch. Another impressive residence was the Hepburn Reynolds House, named for two Brunswick merchants, Charles Hepburn and George Reynolds. The house was built sometime between 1734 and 1742 on property shared by the two men. The remains of an outside chimney indicates the house had more than one floor. While excavating the first level, archaeologists found a charred wooden floor in what was apparently the kitchen. A conjectural drawing of the house shows that it probably had a second-story porch. From the artist, we also can get an idea of the appearance of some of the other structures in Brunswick, such as Nath Moore's front, located near the water, and the Newman Taylor House in the vicinity of the courthouse lot. Ballast stones used for stabilizing ships with light cargoes were thrown overboard from incoming vessels and were used in constructing the foundations of many of the buildings in Brunswick. These stones were generally unnecessary to departing vessels because Brunswick products such as lumber, tar, and pitch served as ballast for the return voyage. Today, thousands of ballast stones can be seen along the water's edge, where they were discarded more than 2 centuries ago. The archaeologist's systematic study of Brunswick has revealed thousands of artifacts that help recall important events in the town's history. Spanish coins and olive jar fragments possibly had some connection with the Spanish attack on Brunswick in 1748. The attack was so sudden that the townspeople were forced to flee with only a few articles they could carry with them. The Spaniards were unopposed as they plundered Brunswick. But after having time to organize, the area residents drove the Spaniards from the town. During the battle, the Spanish ship Fortuna exploded and sank in the river just off Brunswick, killing 90 men. The townspeople were able to salvage a number of items from the Fortuna, and the proceeds from the sale of these articles were used in the construction of Wilmington's St. James Church and St. Philip's Church in Brunswick. St. Philip's was begun in 1754, but by 1760 the building was not completed. It was Governor Arthur Dobbs' intention to have the church designated as His Majesty's Chapel in North Carolina. Yet the structure was still unfinished in 1765 when the governor died. It was not until 1768 that the building was finally completed. Unfortunately, less than a decade later, much of the town lay in ashes, a casualty of the Revolution, and the church was probably burned at the same time. A bottle seal unearthed by archaeologists is another reminder of an important event in Brunswick's history, the Stamp Act resistance. William Dry, merchant and public official, was a principal character in the drama which unfolded in the Lower Cape Fear in 1766. The Stamp Act, imposed upon the colonies by the British government, was a tax on various papers and documents. The tax was designed to provide funds for the defense and administration of the colonies. As collector of customs, Dry was bound by duty to uphold the act, even though he was opposed to it. Approximately 500 armed men marched on Brunswick, compelling a number of public officials to take oaths that they would not enforce the act in North Carolina. As a result, no stamps were issued in the colony. Shortly afterward, the Stamp Act was repealed by Parliament because colonial protests were affecting the profits of British merchants. Even before the Revolution, there were signs that all was not well in Brunswick. The marshy, humid surroundings discouraged settlers, and the growth of Wilmington not only took business but also people away from the port town. Because it was located nearer the ocean and the mouth of the Cape Fear River than Wilmington, Brunswick suffered more severely from storms. Strong trade ties with inland settlements had failed to develop, and the removal of the governor to New Bern in 1770 was a considerable loss. But foremost in the residents' minds was the vulnerability of Brunswick to attack. The Spanish invasion of 1748 was not easily forgotten, and on the eve of the Revolution, the danger from attack was just as great. So when the British landed in 1776, many townspeople had already left with most of their belongings. For the second time in less than 30 years, Brunswick was at the mercy of hostile forces. Newspaper accounts tell of Brunswick's fate. What was left of the town served as a rendezvous for both sides at different times during the Revolution. Only a few people returned to Brunswick at the war's end, and by the 1840s the town site had been added to the holdings of Orton Plantation. But Brunswick was to play a role in another important conflict. 86 years after it was burned in a war to unite the states, Brunswick became involved in a war to divide them, the war between the states. In 1862, a twin-battery, 10-gun earthen fort was constructed across the northern portion of the town site. It was originally called Fort St. Philip's, with the walls of St. Philip's Church inside the fortifications. The name was later changed to Fort Anderson in honor of General George Anderson. The facility became an important link in the lower Cape Fear defenses. Batteries A and B, with their impressive mounds, were in an excellent location for guarding the Cape Fear Channel. Fort Fisher, located across the river to the south on Federal Point, was responsible for keeping New Inlet and the port of Wilmington open for trade during most of the war. But in the middle of January 1865, Fort Fisher fell into Union hands. A month later, on February 19th, Fort Anderson met the same fate, and within 3 days, Union forces marched into Wilmington unopposed. Nearly a century of neglect had taken its toll on Fort Anderson when archaeologists began excavations in the 1950s and 60s. Then in the mid-1970s, it became apparent that natural erosion and the footsteps of thousands of visitors were wearing portions of the fort away. Measures were taken to stabilize these areas. Large sections of the earthworks were built up and uniform pathways were constructed. Today, Brunswick town exists only in its lonely, shadowed ruins. The now peaceful surroundings make it difficult to imagine a Spanish or British invasion or homes and businesses in flames. But here in the Visitors Center, artifacts from the ruins bring the story of Brunswick town to life. The staff of Brunswick Town State Historic Site is pleased to welcome you. We hope you enjoy your tour and that you'll come back to see us again. While you're in the area, be sure to visit Fort Fisher, which is another of the more than 20 state historic sites administered by the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources. For those who are interested, a free historic sites brochure is available at the reception desk.